Hello, I'm going to introduce the Project 2 assignment. You can find the assignment link on Canvas. You can also find it in your course pack file. And in your course pack, it'll be in the green pages, and the first page looks like this. The title of the project is The Influences on Climate on the Galapagos Tortoise Population. You can see a picture down here of several Galapagos tortoises, along with several of the math and science faculty who went to the Galapagos Islands in August of 2023. I'm wearing the pink and the hat right here, that's me. And then Miss Christie's over here in the pink next to her daughter. In the back row, there's Steve Tuckey, science faculty, Alana Tuckey, math faculty. We've got Kurt Blankenspore, science faculty, and Jessica Tashman here, also science faculty. And several of the other people with us were friends or family members that came on the trip with us to the Galapagos Islands. This project is going to span several chapters of the course. And it will be due at various times. We'll talk about those via email instead of in the video because it's going to vary section to section. But there are three parts, part 1, part 2, and part 3, and then the final project will be due at some later date. I think that date is on Canvas. For each submission, you're going to have two things to include. One is going to be a PDF scan of your written work, or if you are in person, you can hand that in on paper. And that's going to be along with the green pages in your course pack. There's space to write and answer the by hand questions here. And then you also need to submit your Desmos file where you've done all the technology work, and you're going to organize this by creating new folders for each part of the assignment. So starting with part 1, we'll make a folder for part 1. Top of the page, we've got a picture of a baby tortoise, compliments of the Darwin Research Center. And that's the research center where they breed turtles and reintroduce them into their natural habitats to understand the reproductive biology and especially in relation to climate change on these tortoises. We're going to look at some of their data down here. So Galapagos tortoise populations are strongly influenced by temperature. It says in the wild, the tortoise lay their eggs in sand or sandy soil and cover them with a nest cap of sand and soil to insulate them and keep the temperature of the nest fairly constant. To study the effects of temperature on Galapagos tortoises, research gathered data from tortoises in captivity under controlled conditions, where they were able to monitor the temperature and keep it constant. So tortoise eggs were incubated at different temperatures, and the results are shown below. Before I look at this table, I'm going to read below here. Galapagos tortoise eggs are undifferentiated by gender when they are first laid. The temperature at which the eggs are incubated has a significant effect on the gender of the hatchlings. Since we only have 2 data points for each of the genders, we're going to use linear models for this data. So if I look back up at my table now, I can see the temperatures. I can see the percentage of hatchlings that do hatch, of eggs that hatch successfully. And I can see the percentage of those that are going to be male tortoises versus going to be female tortoises. So at the cooler temperature of 25.5 degrees Celsius, relatively cool, that's still nice and warm if you're outside, but that relatively cooler temperature, only 16.4% of the eggs hatch, but 91% of those are male, only 9% are female. We can see at 29.5 degrees Celsius, 40.3% of the hatchlings will be successful, only 34% of them will be male, and 66% will be female. If the temperature gets as warm as 33.5 degrees, none of the hatchlings survived. Survival rate is 0. All right, so your job is to make a folder on Desmos to organize your work. Then you're going to find a linear model to predict the percent of hatchlings that are male as a function of temperature. So for the first part, I'm looking at my male as a function of temperature. I'm going to start by defining my variables, choose the variable name, and describe what it means, including units. Make sure that you select a letter for your variable name that's going to represent the data that you model. Don't use the generic X and Y. you'll pick your variable name and tell us what it means, including units for your input and output variables. Then you're going to make your linear model. You can make this with regression. You can make this by hand, your choice of how to create your linear model. But you need to express it using function notations. It actually does say to use decimals here, so you'll be able to show your work and give 3 places. But you can use by hand methods on decimals or regression methods on decimals. That part of it's your choice here. Then we do the same thing for our linear model for the percentage of hatchlings that are female as a function of temperature. So we're looking now at the percentage of percentage of female tortoises as it corresponds with the temperature. You'll need to declare variables again, choose the letters for these variables, and list them with their units as it says up here, same idea. And then make your linear model for the percentage of the percentage of tortoises that are female based on temperature. All right, so number 3 will ask us to discuss the slope of each of the models and what it means in the situation. So you'll talk about whether it's increasing or decreasing and by how much. And you'll talk about that for each of them. Then you'll also write about how the slopes of the models relate to each other and why it makes sense. So why it makes sense might have something to do with what you noticed amongst the comparisons of temperature and the number of males and females at certain temperatures. Hopefully what you find with slope will match your intuition based on your models, and you can explain that here. Number 4, we're going to suppose that there is a group of eggs incubated at 27 degrees and that 80 of those eggs hatched. Describe what you would expect to find once the egg hatched. So we're asking you to describe how many of those eggs you would expect to be male and female. Remember that the output of your function is a percentage. So the output will give you not the number of eggs that you expect to be male or female, but the percentage of eggs that you expect to be male or female. If you know that 80 eggs hatched, use that percentage to help us determine how many of those eggs you would expect to be male and how many you would expect to be female. Document your process in your description here. Then you're going to look at the intersection point of the 2 linear models, find and label on your decimals graph. What does it mean? Explain. And discuss model breakdown. Explain your reasoning, label any relative points that helped you determine where model breakdown was going to occur by graphing those on decimals. You can see we're going to have a decimals file all in one folder that goes along with this part of the project. This is all linear work right now, so it does correspond with what we did in chapter 2, so we can refresh that and use that to complete part 1. Now we're also ready to talk about part 2. These photographs right here were taken by a few of the faculty on the trip. So we took pictures of these little tiny baby tortoises. These ones had been collected as eggs in 2023 from the island Santiago, so they're very small. This one's getting a little bit larger now. It was collected as an egg in 2020 from the Española Island. So the Darwin Research Center is raising these tortoises and then we'll release them. I think they keep them for about 5 years before releasing them into the wild once they reach a size that they are no longer susceptible to local predation. Now, in this task, we're going to use that same data set, but we are looking at it through a different lens. So it says, suppose you now want to find a model for hatchling success rate as a function of temperature. So instead of gender as a function of temperature, we're looking at hatchling success rate as a function of temperature. There is very little data here, but with the limited data that we have, explain why a quadratic model is probably a good choice. You may need to graph your data before you're able to make that reasoning. So I would go ahead and do that to see what it looks like. And hopefully there will be something that jumps out as a reason why quadratic is probably a good choice with these points, even though it's such a small grouping of data. You're going to define some variables for us again, making sure you choose names that represent the data and you pick the variable and you include units when you describe what the variable means. And then you are going to find a quadratic model and write it out with function notation, the variables that you choose with 3 places. Make sure that you are doing this all in another folder, a folder called Part 2 on your decimals graph, keeping your decimals file organized as you work through these parts. Now, we need to use our model to predict the percentage of eggs that will hatch at a temperature of 27 degrees. And then according to our model, what temperature would result in a hatch rate of 25 degrees. So we've got 2 predictions here that we base on our model. According to your model, what is the best temperature to incubate tortoise eggs? You want as many to hatch as possible. So think about how you would look at your graph and find out what the optimal temperature is. Label that point that you're going to use on your decimals graph once you've found it by graphing as an ordered pair and checking the label box. And then you'll write about it here as well. Then at the optimum temperature from hatching from this question, would there be more male or female hatchlings? This is going to tie back into your functions from part 1. So you'll be able to pull together information here from part 1 and 2 to be able to support your answer here. Okay, number 8, suppose that you start with a group of 240 tortoise eggs, which you incubate at 28 degrees. Describe the results you would expect. Okay, so you can make a prediction for what percentage of those eggs would hatch. You could also talk about the gender of those eggs. You can find out from this 250 how many of them would hatch. You could probably find out how many would be each gender. So you want to use what you know from both parts 1 and 2 to answer this question fully. So you're using all of your models here to get the information about what's going to happen with those 250 eggs. Finally, discussing model breakdown as it applies to this situation, and we're going to be thinking specifically here about the part 2 graphs, as the part 1 model breakdown was discussed earlier in part 1. Okay. That's going to be all right now. We'll come back and talk later about part 3. Part 3 is something that will deal with, I believe, chapter 5. I need to look at this a little further to make sure. But this one is going to look at some other data that's going to involve the rainfall and other climate factors. Since the parts 1 and 2 data was for tortoises under captivity, we're going to further explore what happens when there is a wild element, the rainfall element or other elements affecting the tortoise